Anyway, the suit, it wasn't cheap. You ought to know, you bought it.
Yeah, it makes me learn from my mistakes.
Well, you ought to be pretty knowledgeable by now, then.
If you want something done, you ought to do it yourself.
Mr. Bingley is just what a young man ought to be.
You know, Henry, you ought to have a dog or something.
You're sure you ought to do this?
Everybody ought to have a friend.
Well, maybe I ought to go join the other children.
That's what we ought to do.
I suppose I ought to get back.
So tomorrow I think we ought to get on a plane and go straight back to England.
I think you ought to know that people are beginning to talk.
Yes, I ought to know.
We've never been as close as sisters ought to be.
I ought to be on that boat.